Thank you. It is so great to be here, and I want to give a special shout out of love to all of my international family of queer and trans and non-binary and gender fluid and gender freaky and two-spirit and agender and asexual and demisexual and polysexual and all of those in between and those who love them. This is for you. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it's a really interesting time to be talking about this topic in 2023, because in the 30 years that I've been in this field, it's amazing how much has actually changed in our understanding of the science of gender and sexual orientation. And so in order to kind of explain where we are at this moment and what we know, I need to take you back in time a little bit to a time when some of you may not have been born, to 1992, when this was on the cover of Newsweek magazine, which is a major magazine in the United States, back when people used to read magazines. And the reason for this headline and for this whole issue was that a study had just been published by a geneticist by the name of Dean Hamer, suggesting that there was a single genetic marker called XQ28 that distinguished between gay individuals and heterosexual individuals. And that ushered in a whole new era of research on the nature and biology of sexual orientation. And what's interesting is that that particular study didn't end up replicating and didn't end up panning out, but it really kind of set the stage for a lot of debates about the nature of sexual orientation as a biologically determined trait. And so the strong trait view of sexual orientation kind of came to the fore. And that view suggested that sexual orientation was something that developed really early in life. Perhaps, right at birth, before anyone could ever be aware of it. It also suggested that it was a fixed and dichotomous trait. In other words, you either were one way or another, kind of like a light switch, and it was just stable over time. And also that there was no in-between, between being exclusively gay and exclusively straight. There was really no research on individuals who were bisexual, pansexual, anything in between. It was really viewed as an either-or sort of proposition. And one of the reasons that that view was so predominant is because the only people we were actually studying in the early 90s were generally one group of individuals, exclusively gay-identified men, largely from the United States. And so one of the reasons that this strong trait view was so robust is because it was, viewed through the lens of the people who were doing the research. And so it was not necessarily a representative view of what was actually out there. And so the evidence base in the 1990s, when this era of biological research really started, it was really mostly the United States, also a little bit in Europe, but mostly the US. It was generally just adults, although there were certainly LGBTQ, or actually in those days, it wasn't LGBTQ, it was just L and G. There was really nobody else being studied at all. So there were teens out there, but they were not really part of the research base. And it was also a very biased view based on race, class, gender, and education. There were mostly white samples. There was not a lot of research on ethnic minorities. There were largely samples of men, largely samples of folks who were middle class and highly educated. And so it was a tiny slice of the total population. And one of the things we know from science is that if you have messed up samples, you're going to have messed up data. And the other thing that was a problem was that the only way to recruit folks into studies of sexual orientation at the time, this was pre-internet. I know that's a terrifying thought, but it was pre-internet. And so if you wanted to study sexual orientation, generally the thing to do was to post flyers in bars and clubs and say things like, hey, we're studying the genetics of sexual orientation. Would you like to be in this study? And so the only folks who would volunteer were folks who were already self-identified as gay or lesbian. And so even though, obviously, there's a lot of folks walking around who engage in same-sex behavior, who have same-sex attractions and don't identify, those folks were entirely missing from the research base as well. And the last thing that was really a problem was that the way that we figured out the developmental history of individuals who were lesbian or gay was to capture them at the bar or the club and ask them, when did you first know you were gay or lesbian? How old were you? What happened? How did it express itself? Now, that was certainly a reasonable approach, but as most of you probably know, if you think back to your past, your memories are not necessarily accurate. You might have a memory of a first attraction or a first relationship or a first sexual encounter, but if you actually go back to the other people in your life and ask them, did that happen or did it happen that way? Many of them will say, what are you talking about? It's the wrong year, wrong person, wrong sex act. And so we were gathering data that was flawed in a number of ways. And one of the things that we learned is that most folks, when they recall their past, recall it in a much more linear way than actually happened. And so a lot of people were telling stories that said, well, I always knew, and then X happened and Y happened, and I came out and everything, went great. When in reality, there was a lot more variability. So this was the state of things when I entered the field in 1995 in graduate school, and I had a humble goal. I wanted to simply figure out who was missing, because none of the studies that I was reading in college even had any women in them. So my first goal was just to put women back in the picture. So I went to graduate school at Cornell University. I bought a used 1989 Toyota Corolla, and I basically drove all around New York State. I drove to every major city where gay people were, because I was in Ithaca, New York, where there were plenty of gay people, but I'm like, I'm not sure Ithaca, New York is representative of anything. And I simply wanted to find out what happens if you start to recruit folks into a study, not on the basis of them identifying, but on the basis of them just having the attractions. So, and again, this was pre-internet. I would just go up to strangers, and my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife and who I've been with for 29 years. I know, it is an achievement, and I wish she was here, and she has COVID right now, so I'm sending love to her. She was much more social than I was, so she would just go up to any queer-seeming person and be like, my girlfriend's doing a study. Would you like to be interviewed about your sexuality? And she would just give me these phone numbers of strangers that she met. And what I ended up doing was simply interviewing a whole host of women, and my goal was to just capture them and then follow them over time, which at the time, no one had ever actually done before. And I wanted to know if the patterns of development that people show when you follow them over time were different than the patterns that they narrated when you captured them in their 30s and asked them how they got to where they were. So this little study that was actually my master's thesis was comprised of around 89 women, so a tiny sample by the standards of social science, but I had to drive, like 2 hours for every one of these women. So I'm like, I'm just gonna get as many as I can. They were all between the ages of 16 and 23, and I recruited them from, teen support groups, from college campuses, from word of mouth, just kind of every way I possibly could. And I didn't ask them when I recruited them into the study whether they identified as anything. I just said, I want to know about women who are attracted to other women. And if that describes you, I'd like to talk to you about your experiences. And so I interviewed them face-to-face the very first time, but then I kept in touch with them. And I interviewed them about 7 times over the next 20 years, about every 2 years. And I would catch up with them. How do they identify? Who have they been sleeping with? How many men? How many women? What's sort of happening? And what I was really interested in doing was trying to see if that strong biological trait model that had been based on white gay men showing up, highly educated white middle-class men in the United States, whether that seemed to fit women who were recruited on the basis of their attractions, and younger women. So in order to show you what I found, I'm going to sort of walk you through this graph, and I hope it doesn't look too intimidating. I swear to God, it's going to go fast and it'll make sense. So I had women divided into the groups that they self-identified as. There were some women who identified as lesbian, there were some women who identified as bisexual, and some women said they didn't have a label at all. And I remember when I told my research advisor, some of these women don't have a label, he was very skeptical, and he was like, I don't know if you want to include those. I'm not really sure what they are, which is exactly what had happened to a lot of the bisexual women in previous studies. It was very routine at the time to read studies where they said, there were 5 self-identified bisexuals in the sample, and we deleted them because we didn't know what their true sexual orientation was. Now, in general, in social science, you're not supposed to just throw data away just because you don't understand it, but that was actually the standard practice at the time. And that was exactly why I said to my advisor, no, I'm not going to throw anyone out of the sample right now. Let's just see how things pan out. And so I'm going to show you the first 6 waves of data, and then I have the 7th wave of data on another slide. And so what I had, what this strong trait model suggested was that basically, if you were a lesbian at time 1, you would just kind of stay a lesbian. You would just kind of progress on. As for bisexuals, no one really knew what to expect at that time because, again, a lot of the literature was suggesting that they were in transition or they didn't exist or they were in denial or they were just, curious and they went to college and took a gender studies class and, goodness knows from there. But no one really had a strong expectation of what they would find. As for the unlabeled women, my research advisor kind of predicted that. He said, I don't think those folks are really queer. They probably are just confused. Either they're going to come out as bisexual or lesbian, but in most cases, that category ought to disappear because as time goes on, they'll figure out what they are. So this is what actually happened. And I'm going to show it to you by showing you transitions from one category to another. So for example, this line represents 2 women transitioning from a bisexual label to a lesbian label between time 1 and time 2. This represents someone transitioning from a lesbian label to a bisexual label between 2000 and 2003. So you're going to see a bunch of those lines that show you movements between categories. And already at the first wave of data, and these were the numbers in each group, by the way, already at the first wave of data, 19 of the lesbian-identified women had said they started out identifying as bisexual, but by the time I interviewed them, they were identifying as lesbian. And 7 of the bisexual women said they had started out identifying as lesbian, and then they switched to a bisexual label. And I figured, well, these are young women. That must happen sometimes, but now we know what group they're in. But I certainly expected that those sorts of transitions would fade away over time. That's certainly what the strong trait model suggested. Now, what happened between time 1 and time 2 was that some of the unlabeled women identified as lesbian, some identified as bisexual. I was like, oh, well, maybe my advisor was right, and they were just in transition. What I did not expect was that 6 of the lesbians, unidentified, some of them went to the bisexual label, some of them adopted unlabeled identities, which is not supposed to happen, right? You're supposed to come out. You're not supposed to go into some amorphous category. And I was like, that's interesting. And it also happened for some of the bisexual women. 2 of the bisexuals identified as unlabeled. 3 of them graduated to lesbianism. And, overall, and then this was the most horrifying thing of all. Horror of horrors. That certainly was not supposed to happen. And I thought, okay, and it was more than a third of the sample changed in that 2-year period between time 1 and time 2. And, I thought, well, they're still relatively young. My advisor was like, that will probably work its way out over time. So between time 2 and time 3, we found the same thing. Right, here were the changes from the bisexual category. We got a whole bunch new heterosexuals, which really brought me down. But 3 of the women who had re-identified as heterosexual jumped back out of the frying pan, back into the fire, and re-identified as queer. And altogether, 24% of the sample changed. And most of those changes were for the first time. It wasn't like one small group of women bouncing around. It was like a new group of women. I thought, well, that's a little smaller. I guess we're stabilizing. Then we get to time 3 to time 4. Here we go again. There's the bisexual changes. We got some new heterosexuals. We got some people leaving heterosexuality, and it's 31%. A roughly similar number. Now we get from 2003 to 2005, right? So we're coming up to the 10-year point, and it's the same picture again. More and more changes. 28% change between 2003 to 2005. 2005 was the 10-year point. That's the point at which I wrote my book, Sexual Fluidity. And a lot of people are like, oh, and you followed me for 10 years. I'm like, it kept going, folks. It did not stop at that point. And sure enough, at this point, I wasn't even surprised. I'm like, I give up. Whatever, sure. 25% changed between 2005 and 2008. Then we finally get to the 20-year follow-up in 2015. Surely by now, things will have settled down. Nope, not at all. Same general pattern, roughly same percentage changing between waves, around 30%, 30 to 33. And so at that point, if you counted up all the changes, 71% of women in the sample changed their identity at least once since the time that I first interviewed them. So stability was extraordinary. Fluidity was the norm. And to give you a sense of what these changes looked like, because I'm just showing you lines and numbers, but each one of those lines is a person. Each one of those dots is a person. And hearing some of their stories gives you a sense of how these changes were experienced. So this woman, and the yellow letters at the bottom tell you the identity labels they adopted over time. So this person was bisexual, then lesbian, bisexual, unlabeled, bisexual, back to unlabeled. In 2008, it was very much self-identifying as a closeted bisexual, passing as heterosexual. After the breakup of my marriage, my same-sex attractions have gone wild, and I went through a period of wondering if I was discovering evidence that I was naturally lesbian and had been fooling myself about attractions to men all this time. Now that things have settled down, it has once again become clear that my sexual attractions are to people who show me vulnerability and are not dependent on the sex of the person at all. What I love about that quote, and one of the reasons I picked it, is that that particular revelation of maybe my attractions really aren't about gender. maybe they're about the person, was a kind of novel idea at the time. Oh my gosh, you're attracted to a person? What does that mean? You know? And it really went against this notion that gender is the organizing principle around our desires, that it's gender above all. And what's interesting also about this quote is that this woman was not able to figure out that it was the person and not the gender until she had had enough experience in life to be able to compare different attractions. And so on one hand, the kind of developmental research on sexual orientation was obsessed with saying, well, what are your first attractions? What's the earliest attraction you can remember? But early attractions are like, you don't even have a context. You have nothing to compare them to. Adult attractions, where you kind of have different people that you can compare your feelings to, are a lot more reliable in many ways than the attractions you remember as a child. And yet this strong genetic trait view led us all to believe that early attractions are what we should focus on, not your adult attractions. And yet clearly there's a lot that goes on between childhood and adulthood that we all use as evidence of, you know, what we want and who we are. Here's another quote. I think I've become more attracted to men, definitely emotionally, and therefore, for me, I notice them physically more. Women, I can't help but notice their curves and beauty. It's everywhere. Isn't that true? Women's curves and beauty, it's just everywhere. And can pop me out of my flow of attention on men. Like all of a sudden I notice that the sky is so blue. All of a sudden I notice that this woman or this curve is so beautiful. But I find myself wondering recently if my bisexuality is more of a mental perspective. I would still love to taste and enjoy a woman, but I don't seek it out. And I don't want to have a long-term deep relationship with a woman. Or more accurately, I think I only want to have a long-term relationship with a man. This theme of who you want to have sex with or who you want to have a relationship with came up over and over and over again. And what's interesting is that in a lot of cultures, we view kind of short-term sexual relationships as a prelude to longer-term emotional bonds, as if everything is sort of leading there. But what we actually know from evolutionary work and from anthropological work is that humans in general kind of have two different mating programs in our heads: short-term mating and longer-term mating. And what we desire for a short-term partner is often very different from what we desire in a longer-term partner. And so humans in general are sort of prepared to differentiate between short-term and long-term in a way that may actually be more influential than differentiating between women and men. And this is something that came up in a lot of women's stories. Here's another great example. I mostly think of myself as a lesbian who occasionally sleeps with men. I used to think of myself as bi, but discovered that I'm not able to sustain interest or attraction in men over time. All my long-term relationships have been with women. So again, short-term versus long-term. Short-term relationships with men doesn't necessarily predict an interest in long-term relationships. In 2008, I was in a monogamous 6-year relationship with a woman, and I don't think I had any erotic thoughts about men until summer of 2009. But hard to say now, except that I was definitely lesbian identified and out to everybody. It started to change around 2009 when I also started to practice yoga daily. Who knew? And meditate. And get more in touch with myself. There were some erotic dreams of a man which I shared with no one. I wonder if the yoga industry knows that they're capable of creating some erotic transitions in some unsuspecting, women. Maybe the way to keep your children heterosexual is to send them to yoga. when I started to publish and talk about these findings, there were a number of reactions that I typically got. One was women would kind of come up to me quietly afterward and be like, I thought it was just me. I thought that there was something crazy about me. And in fact, some of the women in my study actually said, oh, maybe you should take me out of your sample. I don't think I'm a very good example of a queer person because I've had kind of a messy background. Little did they know, so did everybody else. And so it just shows the way in which a narrative about what is normal can get inside your head and make you think there's something wrong with you. And so what is fascinating is that for many individuals, when they come out, the story that the normal story playing around in their head is that everybody's heterosexual. And then they have to realize, oh my gosh, that's not the only story. But then they come and they find that there's a story about being queer that is just as restrictive and unaccepting of diversity and variability as the story about heterosexuals was. And so we battle with these narratives in our culture all the time. And whenever individuals measure themselves up against a story of what is supposed to be normal and find themselves lacking, it's harmful. It is not good. And so even though, this was a small study, as I started to talk about the findings, I became convinced that there's definitely something going on here because a whole bunch of folks are coming out of the woodwork saying there's something about this that appeals to me. The other reaction I typically got was, shh, maybe, you're probably right, but this is not the time to talk about this because the community is getting a lot of traction out of the genetic argument. And we don't want to burst that bubble that convincing the heterosexual world that queer people are born that way seems like the best way to get them to just let us, live our lives. And certainly that was true in the 2000s and really up until the same-sex marriage debate. The argument that, queer people should be allowed to just live their free lives and love who they want because they can't help it, because they were just born this way and they can't change, that was an argument that appeared to be successful at the time. And the notion that individuals might undergo fluctuations in their attractions and identities and behaviors was perceived as a threat to that argument, even though technically there's actually nothing contradictory about it. There are plenty of things that humans are born, feeling or thinking or doing that change. There's actually no contradiction at all. This is one of those areas in which kind of popular scientific explanations of things, kind of bastardizations of science end up being hugely influential. Most of the folks who were making arguments about the genetics of sexual orientation don't know anything about genetics, right? They were just like, oh, it's genes, right? Genes. I'm like, do you know what a gene is? Do you know what a gene does? Like, would you know a gene if you saw it walking down the street? But this had become a part of this popular narrative. And what folks would often say that they were worried about in terms of talking about fluidity was two things. First, they were worried about seeming to confirm the notion that being gay was a choice. And this is something that, a lot of parents will say to their children, just like, why don't you just choose to do, this or that or the other? And so the gay community would be like, this isn't a choice, it's just kind of how we are. And what's interesting about that whole debate and that whole argument is it sort of goes along with the notion that there's something really awful about it. Saying, I can't help it, it's not a choice, who would choose this? It's kind of like saying it's a disability, some terrible thing, like who would choose this? And I'm like, why not choose it? Like it'd be a great thing to choose. But at that time, choice was used as a code word for being immoral or being selfish or being demented or sick in some way. And so the born that way argument was used to sort of counter the choice argument, even though it goes along with kind of the worst stereotypes of gay people, that it's this sort of illness that we're born with. The other fear that a lot of people verbalized to me was about conversion therapy, that if it's true that individual sexuality shows variability over time, well then, doesn't that just give license to therapists who want to change you from being gay to being straight so that you can live in accordance with what your family wants, what your religion wants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this comes up so often in the context of fluidity that, I always make a point to really address this as clearly as possible. The changes that the women in my study articulated, and you can tell from the quotes I showed you, they were not undertaken with any intention. There was not a single woman in my study who said, I've decided to just be straighter and just see how that goes, or to be gayer. It was kind of like the weather. The weather changes, but we don't change it. The changes kind of happen to us. And what we know from studies of conversion therapy is, A, it doesn't work. That you can change your behavior, for sure. You can decide to stop having any type of sex you want to stop having. But the attractions are not under your control. So the attractions don't change, even with conversion therapy. But what does change is your self-concept. And what it tends to do is to instill a lot of shame, a lot of self-loathing, and often it drains all your sexual desire away. And so conversion therapy is a totally separate topic than sexual fluidity. They have nothing to do with one another. And the fact that sexual attractions sometimes change on their own does not mean that it is safe or effective or wise to try and force it, because any such change that's undertaken out of fear and out of shame is guaranteed to do harm. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of states and counties and municipalities have tried to ban conversion therapy, especially for teens and adolescents for whom it does the greatest damage. The problem now is that a lot of those efforts have gone underground. So it almost doesn't matter if you ban it, because individuals who are practicing conversion therapy are often not licensed therapists. They're often religious leaders, counselors, life coaches, and we should really monitor who our children have contact with and make sure that they're not receiving messages that instill self-hatred and shame, because that can last a lifetime. The other question that I often was asked about these data is, okay, so you've shown that women's identities are bouncing around. What about their attractions? Are you seeing large-scale shifts from one pattern to another? And the answer to that is really no. And I'm plotted on this graph so you can see the kind of average level of same-sex attractions. And I asked women to estimate, what percentage of your attractions are directed toward the same sex versus the other sex, both sexes. Just give me a ballpark estimate. And I would re-ask that question every time that I talked to them. And so what you see is that there are not big up and down shifts over time. Women's attractions generally stayed, in the same range. However, one of the things that characterized each of these groups, the lesbian group, the bisexual group, the unlabeled group, is that a lot of different patterns of attraction kind of lived within each category. And so each of these groups contained a lot of hidden variability, that some of the lesbian-identified women would say they were 60% attracted to women. Others said 95%. And yet both of them would call themselves lesbian. And so it started to seem like, what do these labels actually refer to. They're very much personal choices and not necessarily diagnostic of anything. And so here I'm just going to show the standard deviations for each of these groups. You can see that if you just look at, and this is one standard deviation, almost all of these groups were extremely overlapping, right? And so the notion that you have a very particular pattern and that's a lesbian pattern versus a bisexual pattern, that did not appear to fit the data very well. So one of the questions I used to get all the time was, you've got a fluke. You've got a fluke sample. You've got a weird sample. It's only 89 women. They were all in New York State. You just got some weird kind of group of women. And frankly, I didn't have much to say to that because I didn't know whether or not that was true. There was simply no comparative data at the time. It was the first time anyone had tried to follow individuals over time and reassess their attractions and identities. So there was no way to know how unusual it was. But at that time, there started to be more of an effort to collect data on sexual attraction and identity from big federal surveys, the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, which was done in the United States, all these, this big New Zealand study, the Dimsdale Mental Health Study, a bunch of studies started to do what I had done with my tiny study, but they had big numbers, and they had the power to really see what was happening around the world, and what they found was pretty similar to what I found. So I'm going to show you in one graph data that shows the percentage of non-heterosexual individuals in these studies who showed some degree of change in their sexual self-identification over time. So switching from gay to bisexual, switching from bisexual back to het, switching from bisexual to gay, any sort of change like that. So among the folks who were non-heterosexual, how many of them showed some sort of change if you followed them over time? A whole heck of a lot. And especially, you'll see in the red bars, especially among the women, right? So between 40 to 70% of individuals were changing over time. And I remember being hugely relieved because I was like, maybe it was just a fluke, but it was not. And data that have been collected in other countries keep finding the same thing. If you track individuals over time, you see more variability than stability. And so a couple of patterns really stood out, that you always see more change among women than among men. And when I say women, I mean cisgender women, because all of this research, really prior to, even 5 to 10 years ago, almost all of the studies that were done on sexual orientation completely ignored gender diversity and gender fluidity. It was so trans individuals were not included. No one even knew that non-binary individuals exist. So women here means cisgender women. And we always saw more change in women than men. And when I wrote my book in 2008, I argued in the book that I thought that women might actually just be more fluid than men. I'm not actually convinced that that's true anymore. I'm not sure if it is simply an artifact of culture, that we actually give women a lot more permission to experiment with same-sex contact and same-sex attractions than we give to men. And even within the queer community, queer folks tend to be suspicious of bisexual or pansexual men, and they say, oh, if you're a man, you're either completely gay or you're straight. Women, who knows? So there's such a cultural influence on the way that individuals think about the possibility of change that I'm not sure whether women are more fluid than men or whether we simply give them more opportunities to discover that than we give to men. That's something that I feel like we won't really know until we have another 10 or 15 years of cultural change. But we do see it show up in the data over and over again. The other pattern that I think is really important is that most of the change is among individuals who say at some point that their attractions are in the bisexual range, that they have attractions to more than one gender to begin with. And so that kind of makes more sorts of changes possible if you already start out with kind of a plural pattern of attraction. And here's the thing that we didn't know back in the early 90s that we know now. Directly contrary to the notion that bisexuals don't exist or bisexuals are in transition or any of those things, now we have solid data from every country where the question has been asked that individuals with attractions to more than one gender outnumber individuals who say they're only attracted to the same gender. The most common form of same-gender attraction is same-gender attraction plus some other attractions. That's actually normative. And it's totally different from what, the message that we all kind of got growing up, that there's gay and there's straight and there's like nothing in between. Turns out in between is like most of the gays. This is an example of what we used to think. We used to think that if you looked at all the non-heterosexual folks, most of them would be exclusively gay or lesbian, and then there'd be a small sliver of bisexually attracted folks. Now we have good data suggesting the opposite. So what we now know from representative samples, from population data collected in the United States and in other Western countries, we don't have any decent data on these questions. From Africa, from Eastern Europe, from India, and from China. And let me just note, this is a big problem in all of social science, not just in the study of sexuality, but for a topic that is as stigmatized as sexuality, the underrepresentation of most of the globe is kind of a problem. But it's a problem that we just have to live with, in terms of what we have available. But what we now know is that if this pie, for each of these pies, represents individuals who have any same-gender attractions at all, so we're leaving the exclusive heterosexuals off the graph because they've had enough attention already. What we find is that the single most common pattern is mostly but not completely straight, mostly other gender with a smidgen of same-gender attractions. That's 74% of same-gender attracted women and 61% of same-gender attracted men. That's the modal pattern. Then we have individuals who identify as bisexually attracted, who say they have attractions to more than one gender. That's 8% of same-gender attracted men and 17% of same-gender attracted women. Then the mostly but not exclusively same-gender attracted folks, only 4% of same-gender attracted women and 11% of same-gender attracted men. And then there's the category that we used to think was the main category, the exclusively gay or lesbian category. That is just 5% of same-gender attracted women and 20% of same-gender attracted men. So the pattern that we have been using as the basis for all of the samples of research on sexual orientation, right? All of those samples were based on exclusively gay and lesbian individuals. We based an entire science of sexual orientation on the smallest and least representative slice of that population, which is not very scientific. I don't think I have to make that argument. So plural attractions are the norm and not the exception. The vast majority of same-gender attracted individuals have some capacity for attractions to the other gender as well. And one of the reasons that this matters so much is that if you have a capacity to be attracted to more than one gender, you sort of automatically have more opportunities for change. Because as you go through life and as you meet more individuals, different aspects of your overall capacity may be able to be expressed or suppressed. Some of the women that I studied in my longitudinal study said that the reason that they doubted that they were really gay was because they had some degree of attractions to men. And so they thought, well, as far as I know, that's not possible. So I must be straight. So I can ignore my same gender attractions because I know I have these other gender attractions. So plural attractions create this sort of maelstrom of possibilities and different opportunities that may or may not be realized, that may or may not be acted upon, and that starts to make sense of some of the patterns that I showed you over time. Women would be moving cities, moving jobs, ending relationships, starting relationships, and realizing different aspects of their own sort of sexual possibilities. And one of the things that came up a lot was women saying, I'm not sure if I'm really gay or if I just have feelings for this one person, because maybe they never met someone who activated their capacity for same-gender attractions before. And what's interesting about this story is that according to the strong trait model of sexual orientation, this shouldn't exist, right? You shouldn't be able to have just one same-sex attraction. It's like having just one French fry. It's like, no, no, no. If you want one, you want more than one. And yet, for some of the women that I followed over time, maybe it was just one, right? Maybe it was just one woman or just one man. Our capacities for erotic possibility are broader than most of us actually think. The other thing I think is really relevant has to do with the way that we raise girls and boys to think about their sexuality. And I think this might be another reason why we see more fluid patterns of sexual expression in women than in men. Boys grow up, and not just boys in America, boys in the West in general. And I'm sure this is true, even in Eastern countries, but I'm more familiar with what we know from Western culture, which is that boys are raised to think of their sexuality as like this intrinsic force coming out of them. And boys can really easily figure out as children when they are aroused. They have a nice visual indicator. And so boys are raised to think about their sexuality, to observe it, to analyze it, and to sort of think of it as something they possess. Girls are socialized to be the gatekeepers, to be the ones that say no, to be the ones that close their legs. Girls get the message from a lot of television that they're just not as into sex as boys are. They roll their eyes, like they're just not as sexually driven. So girls are not given the same sort of cultural permission to analyze their desires, to think about what they want, to view their sexuality as belonging to them. And so I think for a lot of women, it takes them until adulthood for them to actually even get in touch with what they actually want and what they actually find satisfying. I think it's an empirically answerable question. If we raised girls to think about their sexuality more like boys do, would they show more stability over time? I don't know. I think maybe we should just start to raise more like horn dog, sex-focused girls and see what happens. Like, let's take it upon ourselves. Horn dog girls, unite. I love that, right? Actually, I recently was lecturing. I teach a course on love and relationships at the University of Utah. And on the day that I talk about sexuality, I talk about the orgasm gap in heterosexual, penile vaginal intercourse, that, 90% of men report having an orgasm every single time they engage in penile vaginal intercourse, but only 50% of women report having an orgasm every single time they have penile vaginal intercourse. And I said to my tender-hearted Utah undergraduates, I said, the orgasm gap in penile vaginal intercourse may be the only gender gap that you personally can eradicate if you decide to do so from now until the end of time. Let's eliminate it. Just go off and do not accept it. End the orgasm gap. So the other question I often get is, okay, if we know that bisexual patterns of attraction, plural patterns of attraction, tend to foster more opportunities for change, then what is the difference between fluidity and bisexuality? Is bisexuality simply a form of fluidity? Is fluidity simply an artifact of bisexuality? This is a really hard question to answer. I don't actually have a good answer because we only know by seeing kind of what people do and what people say. And the end result of being sexually fluid and the end result of being bisexual kind of look the same. Attractions and behaviors with more than one gender. And the notion of bisexuality as a stable orientation and fluidity as a capacity for change is really a question about how you got there. Are you changing from your regular pattern, or have you always had a broader pattern than you realized? I don't know which of those is true. My hunch from the women that I've followed is that fluidity is a better term to describe individuals who say, you know, I'm generally attracted to this, but once in a while, under the right circumstances, I can desire something different. That seems different in character and tone from individuals who say, I have always been attracted to more than one gender, you know, strongly. But we don't have a society that allows us to really tell the difference between those two cases because we still punish same gender behavior and expression so strongly that it's hard to know whether someone is just becoming aware of an attraction that's always been there or whether they are truly experiencing a change. So this is a question that if it's occurring to you, it's a good question, and I don't really have an answer for it. Now, let's talk about genes. Everybody wants to know about genes. Everybody loves genes. So let's talk about genes. As I mentioned, in 1992, we thought there was a genetic marker for same-gender sexuality. That turned out not to be the case. However, the line of research on the genetics of sexual orientation continued on, and it got way better in methodological quality. And there were two types of studies that typically scientists use to make claims about the genetic influences on sexual orientation. One is twin studies, in which they look at identical twins and look at differences in sexual orientation between the twins. And the other, more recently, something called genome-wide association studies, in which, now that we've mapped the human genome, you can actually look at every single gene in an individual and compare individuals with different patterns of sexual behavior. The studies that have been done with twins and the studies that have been done, the genome-wide association studies, have both converged to suggest that the heritability of sexual orientation is roughly around 30%, which is definitely significantly greater than 0, but which is definitely less than 100%, right? So a heritability of 30% roughly means that if you had two individuals, genetically identical twins, and one of those twins was gay, the other twin would be gay around 30% of the time, right? So that is definitely higher than you would expect by chance because the population prevalence of queerness is less than 30%. But if they have identical genes, then you would think that if sexual orientation was genetic, it would be 100%, that you would all, like gay twins would have gay twins, and that just doesn't happen. One of the things that I think is really interesting about that finding is that, you know, if anyone here knows twins, you know identical twins, no one expects that identical twins are the same person, right? We have this layperson's understanding that simply having the same genetic code does not mean that you are the same. Twins begin differentiating from each other instantly. The moment they are born, parents can tell the difference between them. So our genetic code is not some master blueprint for everything about us. It's a starting point, and then we deviate from there. So the 30% heritability is pretty consistent with what we know about human development, that humans are complex. Almost nothing in humans is determined by 1 or 2 genes. That's just not consistent with what we know about human genetics. So there's definitely genetic influence, but it's not deterministic. And the other thing that's interesting is that 30% heritability is actually pretty low when you compare it to some other genetically influenced traits. Personality, for example, extroversion or introversion has a heritability of around 50%. And my favorite is smoking. Smoking we think of as a choice, right? It's a choice to smoke. Well, some folks are predisposed to become smokers because they get more out of nicotine. The heritability of smoking is 60%. And yet, we never have magazine covers like this. So we obsess with some traits more than others, and we analyze the genetic data on sexual orientation with a fervor that we don't apply to other sorts of human traits. The other thing we know from the genome-wide association studies is that there is definitely not one gene that's involved here. Instead, it is hundreds and hundreds of genes that together end up predisposing individuals to same gender behavior. And each gene makes tiny, tiny contributions, and they interact to the degree that one of the recent largest genome-wide association studies that was published in Science magazine with 477,000 genomes, they found that the pattern was so complex that there was literally no way to take any individual's genetic code and predict their sexual orientation from there. So yes, there's a genetic influence, but it is not deterministic. It is not like a light switch that turns on and off. And so it's more accurate to say that these are influences, genetic influences, not genetic determination. And probably the best analogy for this is weighted dice or rigged dice. If you want to cheat at gambling and you get weighted dice so that the certain side comes up more often, you throw the dice. If you have rigged dice, you're not going to guarantee that you're going to roll the 6 that you want to roll, but you're increasing the probability. But you know, you've got that dice and you throw it, and then there's a lot of other things that happen. There's the surface of the table. There's how hard you throw it. There's whether you throw it on the floor or do you throw it on carpet. Is the table hard or is the table soft? There's so many different things that will end up influencing which side of the die faces up. So genetics is like rigging the dice. It's going to change the probability of an outcome, but it cannot predict the outcome because there's too many other influences that go into it. So now, let's talk about gender. Because if you think it's complicated when it comes to sexuality, it gets even more complicated when it comes to gender. And one of the first things that people started asking me when I first started to write about sexual fluidity was, is gender fluid too? The answer is yes. But before getting to that point, I think it's important to point out that one of the problems with the way that we have even studied sexual fluidity and sexual orientation for years and years and years is that we assume that gender is just built in to sexual desire to begin with. We're kind of obsessed with gender-based desire, homosexual and heterosexual and same-sex and other sex. I mean, all of our categories about sexual orientation are all based on gender. Even though, if you actually look at how humans behave and function around the world, most societies are just as obsessed with regulating the social class and the race and the ethnicity and the age and the religion of your sexual partners as their gender. You know, there are very strict rules in a lot of different cultures around the globe about who is supposed to have sex with who. And although we have sort of obsessed with gender, it's like we forget that those other categories exist. And one of the important developments in the study of gender and sexuality has been intersectionality, the notion that we are never one thing. Not a single person in this room is just their gender. You have a background, you have a race, you have a class, you have a religion, you have a nationality, you have a history, and it's impossible to separate those things. I have a colleague named Catherine Stockton who's written a fantastic book called Genders, which if you're interested in gender fluidity, I highly recommend. And one of the things that she points out is that if you specifically look at the American context, in the United States, we've never had 2 genders. We've had 6. White man, white woman, black man, black woman, native man, native woman. We have never made the same rules about gender for whites as for blacks and for native individuals. And so we can't even think about gender-based desires without adding in those complex elements of class and race that we're not used to looking at because the entire discipline began as a study of largely white American middle-class gay men. So your starting point in the scientific endeavor kind of influences what you find. And so our obsession with gender-based desires is very tightly related to the fact that Western scientists have done a terrible job with race and class and history more generally. And just like some of the questions that we ask with regard to gender would make no sense if we ask them with regard to other social categories. No one ever says, like, are you born attracted to rich people? You know, are you born attracted to Lutherans or Iranians? You know, it's now like gender reveal parties are such a thing now, right? People cut the cake and they got the test and they're going to reveal what gender the baby is. And, you know, my friend Catherine Stockton in her book says, you know, no cake for race, no cake for class. Are you having a middle class baby? You must be so excited. The other way in which you can see that our preferences for certain races are just as robust as our preferences for certain genders is internet dating. And in fact, there is a fair amount of controversy these days because a lot of internet dating sites are finding that because the algorithms are so good at detecting your preferences and then giving you more of what you swipe on, they reliably produce same race pairings. And very quickly, if you are a white person who prefers other white people, you'll stop seeing anyone other than white people on your list of matches. That's simply because the algorithm is picking up what you want. And some of the companies have become a little concerned about this, and periodically you'll see questions pop up on the sites. Do you think it's inappropriate to prefer a certain race? And certainly in our contemporary culture, where we're very critical of our assumptions about race, there's a lot of individuals who are like, yeah, it kind of makes me uncomfortable to say that I'm drawn to one race over another. But certainly the companies are designed to make profits. They want to give you what you want. And so if we're concerned about the stability of racial preferences, we have created a new industry that's designed to kind of monetize them, and yet we don't have the same debates about racial preferences in dating that we have about gender preferences. And this just is an example of how weird it would be if we took this seriously. I frequently get emails like this all the time from just concerned citizens, like, my daughter is, dating someone as a girlfriend. Is this a real thing, or is she just in some sort of stage? And when parents ask a question like that, they're asking, does my daughter have an orientation toward the same gender, or is this just experimentation? And yet, I've never gotten an email that sounds like this. My son went to college, joined Black Lives Matter, and has a black girlfriend. How do I know whether he's really into her or whether this is experimental or political, right? No one ever asks about whether people have an other race orientation. And certainly when interracial marriage was legalized in 1964 in the United States in Loving versus Virginia, no one ever argued at that time, it's important to protect the right to marry someone of another race because some people can't help it. They're born that way, right? So we make totally different calculations when we talk about gender-based preferences than when we talk about racially based preferences. And yet both of them are major drivers in sort of the intimate infrastructure of our day-to-day lives. And it just shows how culturally embedded these things really are. So let's talk a little bit more about gender fluidity. One of the things that was certainly true when I was going to graduate school was that people used the term sex and gender to mean different things. The term gender was used to refer to your sense of your identity and your sense of your social role and your sort of position in society. And the word sex was used to refer to your biology, your anatomy. And so people talked about everyone as having a biological sex and then a gender presentation, a gender role, and a gender identity. And so according to this view of sex and gender being different in these ways, you can have someone who has a gender that differs from their biological sex. And that was how we typically used to think of transgender individuals. They have an identity that differs from their biological sex. The problem is that we were wrong about the whole biological sex thing. We used to think that everybody had a single biological sex. We actually have more like 5. And actually, after puberty, we have 6. So if you think you have a biological sex, I'm very sorry to inform you that you don't. And what we have are 5, and then after puberty, 6 layers of sexual differentiation that usually line up in the same way to suggest a unitary biological sex. But in actuality, we almost never know exactly where individuals fall in terms of those layers. The first layer is chromosomes, whether you have an XX or an XY. Those chromosomes code for anatomical development in utero. So you have XX and XY, and that determines whether you end up with fetal testes or fetal ovaries. And so that's the second layer, the presence of testes versus ovaries. Those testes and ovaries start secreting hormones, and there's other glands that also secrete hormones. So then you get a third layer, which is fetal hormone exposure. That fetal hormone exposure then influences further development of the anatomy and ends up determining the structure of the internal reproductive anatomy, like the uterus, and for men, the epididymis. Those are the internal organs. And then you get the 5th layer, which is the external genital anatomy. And then after puberty, you get the 6th layer, which is muscular changes, the Adam's apple, breast development, all of the other fun stuff. So one way to understand how these things fit together. I like to think of it as the Olympic rings because it's so international, right? So we have these beautiful rings, and for any two layers of sexual differentiation, you can look at the degree to which they overlap. And for some of them, the overlap is almost perfect, and in other cases, the overlap is pretty minimal. And so you can imagine you start out with genes, that's one layer, then you've got fetal gonads, then you've got the fetal hormone exposure, then you've got internal reproductive anatomy, then you have external genitalia, and then you have postpubertal physical characteristics. And so when they all generally lean in the same direction, we say, okay, that's your sex. If they're all leaning in the male direction, we say, you have a girl direction, we say you have a girl. If they lean in the boy direction, you have a boy. But here's the thing. We only use one of those to assign a child's gender at birth. We look at the external genitalia. If it's penis, we call it a boy. If there's a vulva, we call it a girl. We never actually know, unless something goes wrong and the doctor does a million tests, we never actually know where a child lands on all those other layers of sexual differentiation. We're making an assumption. In most cases, the assumption works reasonably well, but that assumption gives the impression that sex is binary, when in fact we know that all of those layers intersect in really complex ways, in a truly non-binary way. So that's why most psychologists and biologists have gravitated towards saying birth-assigned sex rather than biological sex, because there's not just one, and no one wants to say biological sexes ranging from genetics to hormones to, epididymis, blah, 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 blah. So, this notion of boy versus girl is an inference that we make. We never actually observe it. And there's plenty of cases in which those different layers do not line up perfectly, and one or two might be different from one another. And so if you think about every single person in this room, every single person in this room has a different degree of correspondence between those 6 different layers in their own development. So is that a boy? Is that a girl? What is that? So you can imagine if we're all one of these patterns, then is that a same gender relationship or an other gender relationship? What about that? What about these? Right? You could argue that once we really look at the complexity of gender, it doesn't really make sense to talk about same gender and other gender attractions at all, because we don't know what gender actually is. Now, society kind of solves this for us because it just says, hey, all we need to worry about is just look at the genitals, call it a boy or a girl, and then you have your answer. But think about this again with the analogy of race. We kind of make the same conclusions about gender, these sort of oversimplifications that we often make about race. And here's a quote from Catherine Stockton. We put the words girl and boy in kids. This is an intrusion to which they don't consent and to which they must respond their whole lives long. It can be hard, to put it mildly, to get words off of us, especially words put onto us before we were born, right? That word, girl or boy, that we base on the external genitalia alone, then becomes a sign hanging over our heads that biases everything we think about ourselves and about other individuals. And just imagine if we did this with race and ethnicity, right? So what if you do one of those, 23andMe tests and you find out that you are partly Mexican and partly Scottish and partly Ethiopian? What is that, right? What sign, what word do you want to put on top of that? What are you erasing? And what are you validating with those words? And all of these terms, the point of this is to just drive home that all of these reductions that we make are always partial explanations of sort of the complexity of just basic human development. And I like to think of those terms and categories as heuristics, as mental shortcuts. We take a complex reality and we boil it down in order to capture engiativity, which is simply a fancy word for groupiness, for the notion that some things seem similar and some things seem different, that we can't help observing that with our human brains. And so we see groupiness, we see engiativity, and we want to define it. We want to find a label for it. That's just a human kind of brain tick that we do. But whenever we do it, we have to be aware of what we're missing. And the truth is that over the course of social science and biological science, we have always been creating and then challenging and then recreating and then re-challenging and then creating and challenging again human types. Are you black or are you white? Are you this or are you that? What group do you belong to? We do it with almost everything about humans. We do it with even neurodiversity. We used to think autism was one thing. Now we realize there's a whole spectrum of neurodiversity that doesn't fit into a single category. In the same way that we realize that race and ethnicity is a spectrum. In the same way we realize that sexuality is a spectrum. In the same way we realize that gender is a spectrum. It's like, wow, we can't seem to break this habit. A part of the reason we do that is because it's really how our brains are wired. We do not do very well with complexity. And in fact, that's a good thing. If your brain was accurately perceiving every single bit of complexity in your environment, if you were seeing and processing every bit of complexity in this room, your brain would simply kind of lock up and freeze and stop. We can't. We can't process that much information. Our brains are designed to take the complex world and figure out which of these differences matter. And the way that human brains figure out what differences matter is we pay attention to what other people think matters. So we grow up gravitating toward the categories that we see our reference group making. So if you grow up in a culture that makes a big deal about gender, so do you. If you grow up in a culture that makes a big deal about race, so do you. That is just what humans do. And I think the solution is not to kind of, assume that is just a natural thing or to agonize about it, but to just know that whenever you're perceiving a category, that's a little bit of a brain tick. And to get in the habit of saying, there you go, little human brain, trying to help me make sense of the world. None of us are actually seeing the world as it is. We are reducing the complexity that is there. The other thing I think is important to realize about categories is that they serve multiple ends. I've spent my whole life breaking down sexual categories, but I'm a queer woman. I enjoy being a queer woman. I value being queer. I value being a woman. You can have categories that have personal meaning, categories that have political meaning, without thinking that those categories are natural types. We can have our cake and eat it too. We can have the categories that are meaningful to us without believing that they represent some intrinsic part of the universe that we are so privileged to observe. So I think we just have to get used to having the uncomfortable feeling of inhabiting categories that are largely made up. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that a lot of this has started to change because of the internet. The internet has allowed individuals growing up today to have more knowledge about people who have different categories and different ways of experiencing the world and different ways of experiencing themselves than ever before. And the result of that has been a huge increase in the number of individuals who identify as queer and trans and non-binary. This is some data that was collected by the Gallup organization in the United States about the percentage of individuals identifying as LGBTQ over time. And as you can see, kind of things were going along, and then boom, between 2020 and 2021, you get this uptick. And so now we're at 7.1% of the population in the US saying that they identify as somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum. That's twice as many as did so in 2012. That's a pretty big increase. The other fun thing about this increase is that we can blame it all on Gen Z. Gen Z and the millennials have just taken off, right? And one of the things that we know from interview studies is that a lot of them are like, I don't care which letter in the LGBT, like that's like you old people. Like sexuality is a spectrum. It's like, whatever. They have a different way of thinking about sexuality from the beginning, and it's because they have more models out there. If you can compare the way people think about their gender in Thailand and in Mexico and across history, you start to see that maybe those categories are kind of up to you. And maybe all you need to know is whether you are different from what everyone tells you you ought to be versus similar to what everybody tells you you ought to be. So one of the things we do know is that in the same way that individuals are more likely now than before to view their sexuality as fluid, they're also way more likely to view their gender as fluid, to view themselves as being somewhere on the spectrum between male typical and female typical, or that they inhabit multiple genders at the same time, or that their capacity to express a certain gender presentation changes over time. And this is like nothing new. It's like, oh, wow, this sounds kind of familiar. Maybe it's stable, maybe it's not. Some individuals feel they have a single gender pattern, other individuals don't. There's nothing new under the sun. It's the same phenomenon. The biggest increase by far in the past 5 to 10 years has been in the non-binary category. That is the group of individuals who has surged the most. And what's fascinating is that that language did not even exist 20 years ago. So we didn't even know how many non-binary people there were 20 years ago because it literally was not a word you could use. And it just shows the degree to which making available a different language for human experience then allows certain experiences to be observed and talked about in the way that they were not before. And I think the two most powerful examples of this have to do with what we now know about the brain, which is that there are no female or male brains. Female and male brains were sort of an artifact to the way we used to measure certain structures in the brain that were more common among cisgender women versus cisgender men. Now we have better brain data that suggests that all of our brains are mosaics. They are like those wonderful Italian mosaics where it's like you see a pattern from far away, but when you get close up, you see that it's like red and blue and green and white and over and over and over again. That's exactly what the brain looks like in terms of gender-typed patterns. So any perception we used to have of a male brain versus a female brain was artifactual. All of our brains are mosaics. And the analogy that I've heard some people use about kind of non-binary and trans identities, which I think is perfect, is with left-handedness. That back in the days, before we realized that left-handedness was a thing, we just made everybody write with their right hand. We had right-handed desks. We taught children how to write with their right hand. There were no left-handed individuals. There were just a lot of unhappy children who couldn't write very well. Once we realized that there were left-handed children and we allowed them to just be left-handed, the number of kids who were left-handed shot up and then plateaued. right? If you make a category available to people whose experience fits it, you're initially going to see a surge, and then it's going to stabilize. That is pretty much what we're observing right now. The non-binary category didn't exist. For many children, the trans category didn't exist. So when you see people being like, this is crazy, this increase, that's gotta be like, it's a fad or it's social media. And I'm like, it's basically what happened with left-handedness. You make available a capacity for a diverse experience, and individuals inhabit that experience. Doesn't mean it didn't exist before. We just didn't really have the language to even understand what it was. And all of this, of course, has become more fraught in the current climate. I will tell you, I never in my life thought that I would see the regression in people's attitudes towards sexual and gender diversity that we've seen, particularly in the United States. It is a time of almost going backward. And I honestly think it is simply due to, we're victims of our own success. The more individuals identify as LGBTQ, the more panicked individuals get that we're taking over or we're, seducing their children or whatever. So in some sense, this is sort of a natural sort of backlash, but it does worry me. And some have said to me, maybe, you've made the case before that we shouldn't, we should still talk about sexual and gender fluidity, even though some individuals might think that it supports the, conversion therapy or something like that. You should still, be kind of wary of that. Well, what about now? Isn't it worse? Isn't it more dangerous now to talk about fluidity of sexuality and gender because you've got sort of a hostile climate? I've got to believe that there is never a benefit to suppressing information about the actual diversity of human experience. As a scientist, I cannot believe that that's the way to make it through this moment. And frankly, it doesn't really, the folks who hate LGBTQ individuals are not actually that interested in the science. So they hate LGBTQ individuals just because they hate them. They're not like scrutinizing scientific papers and saying, well, this finding, suggests this or that. So my feeling is I'm going to continue to talk about the reality of what we see in the data and what we're seeing in children and youth today, because it's the reality of that diversity that we have to honor, and that's going to get us through this. But I do think we're going to need to work harder than we have before to say it doesn't matter why this diversity exists. It doesn't matter which part is genetic or which part is this. It does not matter. Either we're a society that believes that human diversity is to be respected and protected, or we're not. Just game over. The science is just what we do on the side, but we have to make decisions as a culture about whether we think that human experience as it presents itself to us deserves to be respected and protected. Hopefully, right? Hopefully. So just to end, one of the things that I think this research shows, and frankly, there's data on this and other human traits as well, is that plasticity in human experience and diversity in human experience is nothing new. Humans are kind of complicated. We have these big brains and we develop very slowly. And one of the things we know is that because of brain plasticity, humans are always generating new forms of humanness. We're extremely uncooked at birth. Humans, are basically like gummy worms when we're born. And our brains are turning over and developing and absorbing experiences. And we evolved to do that because human brains need to absorb input from our surroundings in order to know what direction to grow in. So brain plasticity is a fundamental feature of humans, and that is going to generate plasticity and variability in developmental trajectories. Plasticity is a defining characteristic of humans. Humans have more plastic brains than any other mammal. That is our master adaptation, the ability to adapt and to change. And so we need to look at that variability when it shows up and not say, oh, that's weird. We need to be like, there's humans doing what humans do, which is to show this incredible diversity of experience. And so when I think about the born that way argument, it's sort of totally inconsistent with everything we know about brain plasticities, because frankly, there is only one way that humans are born, and that is changing. We start changing the moment we come out, and we keep changing, and we change quickly and rapidly when we're very young, and the changes slow down as we get older, but they are still there, and that is a key feature of human experience, which means that there's no way that either gender or sexuality could not be fluid. It would be inconsistent with everything else we know about the human brain. And so with that in mind, I will leave you with this one thought, that if you think your sexuality or your gender has finished changing or has finished developing, you might be wrong. Think again. Thank you.